So last week we had A Quiet Place 2 come out, and next week we have The Conjuring 3 coming out. So apparently we're just going to stick in this horror vein for a while because these next two obviously fall into that category as well. So I think of these two I want to start with Spiral. Spiral from the Book of Saw being the whole title. And there was this whole confusing thing at the start there where all we knew for a long time was that Chris Rock was going to be potentially rebooting Saw. And then it was like, first he was like an executive producer, but then he was going to star in it. And then we kept getting word that like the whole thing was pretty much his idea. And that's one of those things that you hear and you're just like, number one, is that real? And number two, if it is real, will it exist or not, or is this something that'll just kind of be scrapped and not end up going anywhere? Um, and it turns out that not only was it real, but it is now in its final form here. So yes, a Chris Rock backed and Chris Rock starring Saw movie now exists, and it's still like even after having seen it, it's still kind of weird. It's still kind of setting in that this exists at all. And he brought Samuel Jackson with him. So there's that. And at first I was wondering like if it was his idea. Like, is he gonna try directing it since he's directed a few things already? And it's like Chris Rock directing horror. That'd be really interesting. But no, he didn't commit to it that much. But Darren Lynn Bousman came back to do it. So this was all kind of like, and I'd say he's probably the most recognizable as far as how his style kind of gave Saw what its look is now, even though it started with James Wan. But I think when you think Saw, you probably think of the really flashy shit that's in the Bowser movies. And so this is that basically. Like, it has that same look and everything. It just happens to have some bigger names in it. And apparently what the whole thing was that Rock loved the franchise and happened to be at a wedding with like the head Lionsgate dude and said that he was interested in making a Saw movie because he thought all the others were humorless, basically. Like, he thought kind of adding doses of humor into it, or in his kind of humor specifically, might do something a little different, like give it maybe a slightly different feel or liven it up a little bit more, or have at least kind of a nice sort of contrast with all the darkness and the grittiness and the gore and all that stuff. Find some kind of balance. Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what that meant until one of the opening scenes happens, Rock's first scene. And yeah, he's basically doing a stand-up routine. He does like a whole routine on Forrest Gump, and it's and that's how it starts basically. We do get a trap at the beginning, obviously, before we see the title. A relatively vicious trap, but not to the extent that we've seen before. Where it was like kind of like when we had Jigsaw, we had the one where it was. All the traps seemed a bit primitive by comparison, but then that ended up being for the purposes of its twist. And here, it's no secret going into it that the concept of this one is a Jigsaw copycat, which might explain why some of the traps aren't as elaborate, I guess, because we don't quite have John Kramer's. I struggle to say genius, but that's, yeah, the level of what he was working with. So some of the traps might be sort of underwhelming to like the diehard Saw fans, but I still think many of them were twisted enough, and there were some that were like, I kind of like the simplicity of them. Like there's one involving wax that's particularly simple. That's like still incredibly sadistic, but like where the bar is by the time we're on our like ninth Saw movie now, eighth, and I can't remember. Yeah, this is the ninth. Jigsaw was the eighth, and the 3D one was the seventh. Yeah. So I did do that video on the whole franchise back in October, where I basically said, I guess I could have started with this, that overall I can appreciate the series and how they've managed to evolve and kind of get more creative as they went, despite the fact that they're often dismissed as just like the poster child of the whole torture porn era. Um, but there is something in those where like some thought was put into it and how they've unraveled as such a big franchise as they have, and like there's always those turns in it that kind of keep the story moving and like as one whole story, that has all these different facets in it, and everything keeps coming back around, is surprisingly well thought out for the kinds of movies that they are. Um, so in this one, it kind of feels a bit separate, sort of like how we had, like how Friday the 13th Part 5 just ended up being a Jason, copycat. This is basically the Friday the 13th Part 5 of the Saw franchise, I suppose, but it's going in telling us that, and how it's in the same universe, but it's kind of feels off to the side at the same time and kind of its own thing. Um, which is why I think Rock bringing humor into it isn't as jarring as it might sound at first. Um, but as far as like Darren Lynn Bousman coming in to direct, there is a case of there's nothing particularly like visually stand out about this, because it's kind of like if the traps are going to be a little more primitive, like how is this going to stand out from the rest of them? And it's like usually the first step in trying to stand out would be visually unique. But really, even for a Saw movie, it doesn't really seem to try a whole lot. There's one instance towards the beginning that may be something I've never seen before, which is it's a small thing. Um, there's like this police raid, and somebody gets punched, and when they get punched, their blood hits the lens, which we've seen a million times before. But the thing I feel like I've never seen before is then we cut and we saw something through another camera, and then we cut back to that camera, and the blood was still on it. It's like I don't know if I've ever seen it cut back to the blood on the lens before. So that's about as close as we get to anything standing out visually. um, and as far, but there is something here as far as like the character dynamics and bringing in like Samuel Jackson's character and stuff like that. First off, apparently a misconception. I know a lot of people when they saw like early advertisements and when they saw the poster. And even though Samuel Jackson was at the top, his name was at the top of the poster next to Rock's, he had the and. And immediately when you see like the and at the top of the poster, you immediately think big name, tiny part. And I think a lot of people went in thinking that Samuel Jackson was going to be like the opening kill, like the opening trap. But no, he has a substantial role. Like his screen time's still small, but his role is pretty substantial because he is the father of Chris Rock's character, and they have this whole storyline going on that's what's really interesting about this is this basically is basic enough. Like the whole movie feels like minor, to the point that it just kind of feels like another police procedural where the antagonist just happens to be it's a police procedural you'd see on USA or TNT on any time of day. It just happens to have saw traps in it, basically. But the thing about the dynamic between the characters is there is this whole other storyline going on. What's basically a whole other movie involving the police corruption inside the department that Rock and Jackson work for. I believe Jackson's retired at this point, but yeah. And while that's interesting, and they work that into the story through the whole thing, which is kind of where the movie finds its footing. Kind of having that whole police corruption story, and that's how the characters kind of bounce off each other, and it's like, Rock did this whole thing where he ratted somebody out, so the rest of the department is against him, so they're holding up his investigations, and it's like, it's and with all this bad blood, it's like it could be anybody that's actually doing this. And there's definitely something interesting there. Um, it doesn't quite bring the movie up to like a really like good or great level, but it keeps it alive. Like it keeps it breathing through the whole runtime. So there is that, but we do have another thing going on here about familiar things like how it just seems like a police procedural or whatever that you would see any day. We've got that old plot where Rock works alone, but because he got overzealous on this undercover job in the opening scene, now he's getting saddled with a partner that he doesn't want, and he's like, "Nope, I work alone," and it's that whole thing. With Max Minghella being the new partner. And then, as it goes on, and it's basically just a cop movie for a while. Like, there's saw traps in here, but they're not, like, and this actually might be, a blessing for some people that, like, kind of like the Saw movies, but feel like they're maybe a bit too much at times, and the torture's a bit too constant. A lot of this is just a run-of-the-mill cop movie, with maybe 3 or 4 big trap scenes, um, and they're not like excessive, and the trap scenes aren't like overly long or anything. And then the more he and Mangala kind of bond, it starts to kind of actually be like a buddy cop movie, and weirdly, it kind of works a little, not entirely, but it works enough. Like basically the same thing about the police corruption plot was it keeps the movie breathing, it keeps it alive, at the very least. When we're talking about the ninth installment of a horror franchise, as long as you stay alive for the whole runtime, that's getting pretty far. And it's actually kind of a weird breath of fresh air that they didn't just say, oh, constant traps all the time. So yeah, so I actually didn't mind that setup. Like I said, a lot of people might think maybe it's, missing too much of the Saw aspect, but the fact that it sets itself up as, yeah, we're in the same universe, but we're kind of somewhat our own thing also. It's yeah, it's fine, I guess. We do have some stuff where it's like he makes like Rock makes a Twilight joke at some point, and he mentions like hashtags and shit, but which I bash so hard for with Billy Crystal doing that in his new movie. But I do think the whole thing is that Rock's character is meant to be out of touch. So he's saying like all these dated things and stuff like that. Um, because they don't really, like I said, as far as like the character dynamics go, that's kind of where the strengths of the characters are. As far as the characters individually, they're probably kind of lacking. But like I said, there is something here in the dynamic at least. Um, like I said, there's a lot of stuff that's not all that inspired. There's a lot of forced exposition. A lot of stuff told through flashbacks and like the fractured. That's another thing I guess they're kind of trying to do to liven things up a little bit is the fractured timeline. Gives off a vibe of the original movie a lot. Obviously, the whole series has been doing that a lot, but the way it's broken up feels a lot like the first movie, if that interests you. So there is that. But still a lot of forced exposition and the kind of thing where it's like to show that we're in a flashback. Rock and Jackson have like facial hair to show to show that was a while back, and it's stuff like that. But like I said, I guess its main problem, honestly, is there may be some stuff that doesn't quite add up and stuff like that, or stuff that might feel forced. But really, the main problem, I guess, is just that it just feels so minor. And it's like, but at the end of the day, you're just kind of like, all right, but I don't know if there was any reason to make this movie that said like, oh, we're gonna take the Saw franchise and do something new or kind of elevate it. It's like, yeah, they injected that humor in it, and yeah, they kind of tried to tell a story that wasn't entirely focused on just like the gore and the torture, but it still just kind of felt like, yeah, like I said, just really just a, I guess, half an hour longer episode of any crime show that you would see, any Law and Order or CSI or whatever. It's really, I guess, just one of those. Now, that's as far as the setup goes. Now, as far as like one thing that's really holding this movie back, as far as being in this franchise, there is one thing. Like even the Saw movies that aren't as good as some other ones, there is one thing that all the Saw movies have done up to this point, and that is have a twist that completely catches you off guard. Like I said, even the ones that are lesser, like even the lesser Saw movies, will surprise you at the very end in some way or another. And that's literally the franchise's MO. Like, that is their thing. Where it's like, if we're just doing the same old repetitive shit and we kind of suck, we will at least give you an ending that made it worth it. That'll still have you leaving saying, holy shit, I didn't see that coming. So if there's one thing that completely stops this movie from being like really, really worthwhile or really worth the time, it's that it's relatively predictable. And it's like if there's one thing, just one job you have going into a Saw movie, it's at least make the ending unpredictable, because that's the whole Saw thing. um, so that is like really, and and I can see where they like, you can kind of see where they showed certain things to hopefully throw the audience off the scent of the direction they're headed, but it's still, me personally anyway, I couldn't stray away from the thought of, I feel like this is really obvious, and it is. So, that's a big one. That's the one thing you don't want to happen in a Saw movie, is to have a predictable ending. That just goes completely against what this franchise stands for. If you can believe this franchise stands for anything, I would say it's at least that. It's have an ending the audience doesn't see coming, because that will be the only thing they take away from it. Because the torture thing gets very, yeah. Uh, not necessarily that you get, like, you know, used to that, but it's, yeah, that's the one thing you want to do, and that's the moment where it was like, and where it goes once we reach that point, like, the climax is fine, so it's just predictable how we get there, so there's a little bit of a balance there, but like I said, you want that surprise ending when you go into a Saw movie, and that's not what you get. So that's how far that takes you, I guess, will depend on your overall opinion of it. But let's go on real quick to Army of the Dead, Zack Snyder's 2.5-hour zombie movie. That's literally that's how I found out the runtime was. I actually saw a headline that just said that Army of the Dead, Zack Snyder's 2.5-hour zombie movie. And I know, Zack Snyder put something else out earlier this year that makes 2.5 hours sound short. But this feels longer than the 4-hour cut of Justice League. So I'm just going to throw that out there right now. I will say one thing to Snyder's credit as far as conceptualizing this story. When you have a story this over the top, the idea of there being a zombie outbreak and then they're all contained in Las Vegas and they're blocked off, and it turns into a heist movie where this band of people have to go into that barricaded Las Vegas that is filled with zombies and rob a vault. First off, incredible setup. Like, if that was all this movie was, this would have been incredible. And what another comment I was leaning towards in regards to the conceptualizing of this story is that I could have sworn this was like a comic or something. It feels like it. When you picture it in your head, it looks like it. Like, you can imagine it as that. And I was surprised at, like, I looked it up a few times just to be sure. And as far as I know, there isn't a source. This is all Snyder coming up with this idea. Now, obviously, there's going to be, once the movie gets going and it goes in the directions it's going to go, then it doesn't feel so original, but the concept is something really great. And of course, we have our Zack Snyder opening credits, like we usually do, where we get to see, where they basically tell their own story, and we get the whole sort of picture of where it started and then how we get to the point of them getting all barricaded in Las Vegas and all the carnage that it took to do that, and all the damage that it did and everything that it's done to these characters that are going to be the main characters throughout, which probably would have been a better movie, but as far as the look of it, but because it's so, you know, over the top and so wild and so kind of colorful. Like even when, like, you know, blood is spraying, it's like it's adding some sort of burst to like a blank canvas or something. But then we start, you know, introducing the characters, and there's a lot of characters introduced, which is probably where a lot of the runtime comes from. It's not like on Suicide Squad levels of pelting you with information for half an hour, and like stats for half an hour, but it's, you know, we got to establish it somewhat, and honestly, I didn't mind the first half hour that much, but it becomes clear pretty quickly, right about the time they're going into Las Vegas, that they start planting little seeds that immediately say, we're going to take this great concept that's actually quite simple, and we're going to do the problem that happens almost every single time a movie has a great concept. We're going to overcomplicate the shit out of it with subplots and other shit that the characters have going on, and basically barely focus on that amazing concept. And they also do this thing a lot where they keep setting up stuff that you think, and for being a 2.5 hour movie, you would think there's probably going to be probably a lot of, because we've got a lot of characters introduced, we got a lot of things to establish for this world, and it's like, you would think, okay, do that for maybe half, if you have to do that for half the movie, the other half of the movie is going to be all the payoffs. There's a lot of setup stuff that I feel like they kind of forgot about. It's just kind of, like, there's a lot of setups of stuff that just kind of go away. And stuff that sounds really interesting. Stuff that you kind of, like, I mean, there's the case of if they set up something and it pays off in the way you expect, it could go one of two ways. It could either make it seem predictable, or there's the case of you want the audience to want that thing that they know is coming. So it's like, you can either get audiences saying, like, oh, I knew that was going to happen, or you can get your audience to say, oh, I was hoping that would happen about something that you've already set up and may be seen as predictable. But there is a good kind of predictable when it's something the audience wants to see badly, because you set it up that well. Like I said, all the setups are here. But I don't know. I felt like I kept blacking out and missing stuff. But no, there's just a lot of stuff in here that feels like it's supposed to be here that just isn't. The big ass saw stands out. Like, did I fall asleep? Did I black out or something? Or did they, like, never use the big ass saw? I don't know. He uses it in the opening credits. But then, like, it's like his prized possession. Amari Hardware we're talking about. And he just, I don't think he ever used it. Like, I feel like I'm missing stuff. But I'm pretty sure I didn't miss anything. I don't even think I, like, paused it for any reason. I just watched the whole fucking 2.5 hours all the way through, doing nothing else. Nothing was distracting me. Yeah, I felt like I was, like, missing so much because just stuff that was set up wasn't happening. I didn't know what the hell was going on. Um, but there are there's some good things and some bad things about Snyder. Obviously, one of the great things about Snyder is his abilities with action are incredible. Like, you're almost absolutely guaranteed to get amazing action scenes, and there's some pretty amazing action scenes, like the fights and all that other stuff. Um, are really well done. But then we also get, I guess you call him experimental Snyder, which experimenting certainly isn't a bad thing, for the most part. Like, you want a director to kind of, like, try out different things and see what happens. But usually, if the experiments don't work, that's taken care of in post production. But here, because we got Snyder acting as the cinematographer, and we've got a lot of stuff. And there was a lot of stuff like at the end of the Snyder cut of Justice League, where it's like he was playing with focus a lot. Like, a lot of stuff was blurry that probably shouldn't have been blurry. And there's a lot of that. And at first, I thought it was them having to do the whole Tig Notaro thing, where Chris D'Elia went and did some stupid shit, so they had to replace him at the cost of like $3 million by Snyder just taking Tig Notaro and shooting her against a green screen and then just placing her over Chris D'Elia throughout the movie, which is, for the most part, a lot more seamless than that would sound. But there's also cases, like, there are cases where, like, on, like, the ADR, like, when somebody says she, in regards to her character, you can see that their mouths say he, because it was Chris D'Elia at one point. But, there's other cases where, when she was on screen, there was, like, a blurriness around her. And it was like, holy shit, that's obvious. It's like you really just sort of sloppily cut her out and just put her in the scene. And then it was like, that wasn't exclusive to those scenes. Like, that wasn't just we're basically photoshopping Tig Notaro into this scene. No, there's all kinds of scenes that look like that are just, like, blurry around the edges in really weird ways, and I don't know what that was supposed to accomplish. And I don't know that the daylight setting was helping much either, because when you talk about what the movie looks like visually, it's like the poster is, like, really colorful and everything. So when you think about zombies overrunning Las Vegas and our main characters being stuck in there with them, and I've praised a number of horror movies that are set during the day, because it's like, the whole thing is that horror movies usually set at night, because that's when all the creepy shit comes out at night. So it's like, it's always really interesting when a horror movie is, like, entirely set during the day. But this is a case where I kind of frown on that, because it's set in Las Vegas. And it's like, why would you set the entire movie in Las Vegas, but also have the entire movie set during the day? How much more awesome would this Zombies in Las Vegas thing would have been aesthetically if it was not, you had all the fucking lights on? No? Just desert? That's our aesthetic? Okay. Fine. If that's what you want to do. There is one moment when they turn on the generator and the lights in, like, the casino come on. And it's like, oh yeah, this is the kind of aesthetic I was looking for, but that's pretty short-lived. So that's unfortunate. And when it's not, like, desert or, like, the darkness of hallways or whatever, it's just the gray walls of where the vault is. So that's unfortunate. I will say one thing they handled well as far as the darkness goes is, usually when you have horror movies like this, many zombie movies as well, when it's all the characters, like, in hallways and shit, and it's dark, you can't see shit at all. To the movie's credit, in the scenes where you can tell it's, like, dark for the characters, we as the audience can still see everything. So that kind of lighting is much appreciated for scenes like that. Like, if you must do scenes where we're just in dark hallways and shit, it's much appreciated that we can still see, like, which character's which, who's about to be attacked, who's attacking a zombie or whatever. Whoever's fighting what, we can see what's going on even in a dark hallway. So, good on you for that, I guess. Um, but there is also some stuff here that just seems like it's here for the sake of, like we've got like the zombie tiger and like a zombie horse. While the zombie tiger is pretty fucking cool, it doesn't mean like when you actually have a character say out loud "zombie tiger," it feels like it's only there for the sake of your audience saying "zombie tiger." I must tell Twitter immediately. It's like it's shit like that. Like stuff that's made to get people to say the words "zombie tiger" as if it's some really off the wall crazy thing. But it's still cool. I'm not trying to take that away from it. But it felt like an obvious sort of, I guess you could almost say marketing, because it's like like I said, their first instinct is going to be to go to Twitter and say, "Did you realize that Army of the Dead has a zombie tiger?" And like, oh my god, it's so off the wall. I don't know. There's also some robot shit in there, and maybe some alien shit in there that they apparently wanted to hint at but not actually go into. That's another one of those, a couple of those going into things, but not going into things. Um, but speaking of, that's what I was talking about before when I talked about how it's a cool and unique setup that's eventually going to just fall into territory. Yeah, somewhere in these overcomplications with the plot, it just kind of becomes Aliens, plot-wise. Um, so they're not like the presence of aliens, but like the plot of Aliens. Is just what it becomes. Like it's one of those cases where it's like, yeah, you can say, oh, it was inspired by this, or yeah, we were kind of slightly influenced by this, and then there's the cases of it just is that other movie. Like it just is that after a while. Like it doesn't know what else it can do, despite having this great setup. So it's got to do all these other things. There's this whole thing with Batista and his daughter, and the only reason his daughter is here is because somebody else is in here that we don't give a shit about. Which is the reason another character is here, and it's like all of this shit is a lot of the runtime. And I don't. It's honestly just now occurring to me right here in the moment. There's one character that's particularly major that's kind of set up in a big way, and I honestly could not tell you right now what happened to that character. I don't know. But that's pretty much where we are with this movie as far as that goes. There's still moments of tension that are well handled, like a moment where they have to walk through a whole room of zombies that are hibernating. And they have to try to walk through them without waking them, which is a pretty cool scene and like really adds a lot of tension in a really great way. But yeah, after a while, there's actually a lot of stuff that just genuinely doesn't make sense. Like I talked about when I talked about A Quiet Place, how it drove me fucking crazy when the first movie came out, and everybody was just nitpicking the shit out of it and saying like, oh, because of this one tiny little detail, the whole thing falls apart, which is bullshit. This is the kind of movie you want to look at when you see one detail and you're like, oh, okay, then the rest of the movie just doesn't make sense. Garrett Dillon's character especially is so weirdly contradictory. It sends the whole movie in directions of like when I was talking about how this movie should have just stuck to the one concept, it would have made significantly more sense if they did that. Like all of the overcomplications they throw into it are just adding things to it that are like, but shouldn't you have just been doing this in the, like, it's hard to say this without saying too much about some of the turns it has, but a lot of it just kind of genuinely does, and it's not like that nitpicky, it doesn't add up thing. It genuinely, mathematically doesn't add up. A lot of what goes on here in like the last 45 minutes or so. Yeah, and just leaving a lot of it pointless. Like, there are whole portions that this movie devotes time to in its 2.5 hour runtime where not only would there be no difference if you took out these large portions, the movie would make a little more sense without them. So, I don't know. I cannot... So many movies do this. I cannot fathom the idea of having a great concept and to keep straying from it intentionally. I don't get, like, I get, wanting to add layers to the characters and stuff like that so we care when they're in peril and all that, but sometimes they get way too focused on that, and it's like they're trying to become a totally different movie and they forget what they were even doing to start with. And it's, yeah, so that's basically what the movie is in a nutshell. Like, I could basically stop here. So, there was, I guess, one more thing real quick as far as like the early scenes. Another thing that wasn't quite gelling was comparing like the opening scenes to the rest of the movie. I couldn't really tell what the killability of the zombies is. Like, at the start, it almost looks like they're, like, unkillable. Like, you can't even just shoot them. But then, like, the whole movie's just shooting and killing zombies, so I don't know. It was all kind of... Like I said, it feels like there's pieces missing. Apparently, there's supposed to be some animated follow-up or something, like a series of some kind or something. But there's, like, so much that's already been ignored that the movie just ignores entirely, that's pretty much done now. Like, all the stuff, like, it's not like, oh, this can carry over into it. Like, a lot of the stuff that they built up that didn't pay off is just done now. Like, there's no way that can continue. So, I don't know. And honestly, the last scene is just kind of, you know, unexpectedly dumb. Like, what the last scene's going to be, and given everything happens before, it's kind of unnecessary. And I will just say Snyder kind of already did that, so it's, yeah. Like, I was kind of into it for a while there, but then it just kind of started to really, really fall apart, and it's like everybody just kind of stopped giving a shit after a while. And it's like Snyder with his focus, and the writers with their not doing anything. It's, yeah, in the way some of the characters just disappear without a trace. Um, it's kind of a fucking mess. So, I guess I'm going to just leave that at that. And so the next thing is going to be The Conjuring 3, I guess, which comes out tomorrow, so there will be that. If there's going to be anything else with it, I'm not quite sure, but I'll get that figured out. So until that, I think that's it.